Welcome once again to the complete free Flutter course presented by yours truly, Ovidus Mazuro. Now, first of all, I do need to let you guys know something. I have accepted a new position, working, of course, with Flutter, but as a result, I've had a lot less time left over to actually record these videos. So I do need to apologize because I think in the future, these videos cannot come out quite as often as they have before. Now I'm absolutely committed to still publishing this, and I promise you I'm going to complete this tutorial in full. It just might take a bit longer than before. Maybe I'll only be able to release 3 videos, maybe even 2 videos a week, rather than the way it was before, which was 5 or 6 a week. But if I can, I will do my absolute best to still record 6 videos a week, but I'm not sure if that's going to be possible. Okay, that aside, so let's talk about what we're going to do today, what we're going to look at. So of course you guys will remember last time we spoke about navigation, but before that we were looking at stateful widgets, and we saw a certain problem that can very easily occur when we use too many stateful widgets, right? We can pass down data in such an awkward way, and it can really make a huge mess. And in this video, we're going to look at the first solution, kind of the most bare bones one, the one that comes by default with Flutter, which is inherited widgets. In the next video, we're going to abstract on top of that to use provider. Provider, of course, is based on inherited widget, but it's like a wrapper around it. So there's less boilerplate and more, user friendliness, or whatever you want to call it, a few more features as well. But it is, after all, based on inherited widget, so we do need to discuss this first. And then in the video after that, we're going to talk about getX. getX is a relatively new state management package. It also does some other things, but we're just going to look at the state management for now. Maybe we'll look at the other features later on. And getX it's similar to inherited widget and change notifier, but the wrapper is very different. The way we use it is very different, but behind the scenes, it's acting in quite a similar way. But I know some of you guys are going to like working with that much more, so I am definitely going to include it. Then sometime in the future, we're also going to go over Redux and Block, but that's going to be in a different project. But for now, let's go back to this. So in our bottom navbar, we had this index and the callback. And what we're trying to do here is remove this, and especially not have it moving through the different screens, right? I did not at all like option screen, home screen, and stopwatch screen holding these variables when it's not going to use them at all. So what we're going to do is separate the state into its own widget, and I've prepared a little diagram for us here. So before, remember, the direction of state was moving from my app state, and it was moving down here. But what we're going to do instead is make a navbar state widget, which you guys can tell I'm running out of names because it's a bit too similar to these ones here, but that's fine. And the navbar state widget is going to pass down its state to an inherited widget. And then once we have that inherited widget, then all of our different widgets can, inherit that state from it. That's why it's called inherited widget. And the nice thing about the inherited widget is that I can pass down the states in any direction. So for example, I could have the navbar states here inheriting from it, but I could also, for example, and I was supposed to pull an arrow, give it to the stopwatch screen. There's nothing preventing me. I could also give it to a timer screen, for example, or I could do all these different things, but at the same time, I don't need to. So you guys, of course, can imagine that if this was a large project where I had just like hundreds, thousands of different widgets, then something like this, or one of the packages which built on top of this, are going to be really, really useful. Now, the other thing you might have noticed is I'm going to be building 2 different widgets. And why is this? Why do I have a navbar state widget as well as an inherited widget? Well, the reason for this is that the inherited widget is actually immutable. That means the inherited widget can not change at all. And that would be a little bit pointless. What's the point of a state management which can't actually manage any changes of state? So what we have to do instead is hold that state in a different widget, and then we use that state to create a new inherited widget every time. So every single time your state changes, what's actually happening behind the scenes is this first inherited widget is being destroyed, and we're building a new one on top of that. I know if you just hear this, it might sound like a little bit wasteful, but it's not. It really is the best way of doing things. In fact, there's a push in programming more and more to work with immutable objects and to not change any states, but always build new states and so on. It turns out to be better for computers than the alternative, but I'm not going to go too much into that. So we're going to go back here. We are in our, let's actually create a new folder. So in lib, we're going to right click, new folder. We're going to call this state, and we're going to make two new files, which is going to be the navbar state dot and the navbar inherited widget dot. And if we go into the first, our navbar state, we're going to import a material dot, so that's INPM. And again, so what is it that we want this navbar state to do? Well, this is just a wrapper around the inherited widget to actually hold the state for us. So as you can imagine, that means we need it to be a stateful widget. And we're going to call this navbar state. And this right here is going to be a bit funky looking because this is called navbar state. This automatically gets an extra state added to it. So that's navbar state state. That's going to be great. It's going to be fun. And in the navbar state, what we can do is we can actually hold what it is that we want to change. In this case, we want our int index, and we're going to start it off at the value of 0. And actually, this should have an underscore before it because I want this to be a private variable. I don't want people to be able to modify this by themselves. I want them to need to go through the methods we're about to create. And those two methods are going to be a getter and a setter. I'm not sure if you guys remember how we would do that, but we're going to have an int get index, and that's just going to be an arrow function which returns index. So obviously the only thing this does is give me the value here, but it doesn't let me actually go through this directly. And then in my setter, I'm going to have to do something a little bit different, because remember, to tell Flutter to recreate the state, we have to use that set state method. So I'm going to do that inside my setter. And I'm actually not going to call it setter. I'm just going to call it set index. And this will take an index. In fact, I should give it a better name. Actually, it's fine because I have my underscore here. And then I can use set state. And in my set state, I can set my underscore index equal to my index. So of course, this index is the one actually being held in the state, whereas this index, which is not the same as this, is whatever I'm going to pass into this function. So that's just how I'm going to set the states here. And then set index, of course, is going to tell my widget to rebuild. And what is it that we're going to return over here? It's not going to be a container, but instead, we're going to return that inherited widget because this is at the end of the day just a wrapper around that. So I'm going to call it the navbar inherited widget. And I definitely shouldn't be using that. Of course, this doesn't exist yet. So we're going to go back here and import material again. And here we're going to create a class navbar inherited widget, which is going to extend inherited widget like that. And let's see what it tells us. So when we do this, it tells us that we're missing a concrete implementation of inherited widget. Update should notify. So what this is we can tell the widget to ignore something or to listen to certain values or that kind of thing. But for our specific example, The only thing I'm going to do is just delete all of this, and I'm just going to return true. So what I'm doing here is I'm just saying, no matter what happens, if you get a new value, just rebuild everything. The reason I'm doing this is because it's quite a simple app. There's no reason to go into it more deeply. And on top of that, I don't really feel there'll be too much use in teaching you guys how to go into the intricacies of this kind of thing, because you're probably not going to use InheritedWidget that much. The wrappers around it, things like getXProvider, are just much easier to work with. So I think that's what you'll end up using most of the time. So now that we have this, what exactly is it that our InheritedWidget is holding? We can just call it data, but what is the type? Well, the type is going to be whatever state exists here. So as a result, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to rename this with F12 to get rid of that underscore, because my navbar state is no longer going to be private, because I actually want to use that as a type inside my navbar inherited widget. So here's going to be navbar state data, and I need to import this, and then Control-Shift-P, fix imports, make this look a bit nicer. So I have this. And what is this data holding? In this specific case, it's only holding index because that's the only thing I have in here. But if I had, all these other variables here, that would still be held in this data object. That's why I'm using navbar state as the type. And now that we have this, I can create the constructor, but this should give me some kind of warning or error. Let's see if it gives me the correct one. Yeah, it's not giving me the one that I need right now. But the other thing I need in inherited widget is it needs to take a child widget. And this shouldn't be this dot child, this should just be widget child. And this gets passed into super. So super is the parent class, and the parent class can take that child like this. So we're passing the child that the inherited widget is getting to the parent of the inherited widget with the property child. And because I need the child here, that also means that in my navbar state, let's get rid of this, I'm gonna have to take a final widget child, and then I can create a constructor in this way. And then down here, my navbar inherited widget can take a child of child, and this should actually be widget.child to get the child passed into navbar state. And then we can also give it a data of this. Now, this keyword is a keyword we will not use very often. Of course, we use it here in the constructor, but aside from that, you won't really see it too much. And all this, the keyword is, it means this current object. So by saying navbar inherited widget data this, that means the data is this entire navbar state, or the instance of the navbar state that we're creating. Now we're almost finished with this, but there is one more thing I want to build. It's not necessarily required. We could skip it, but I don't think that's a good idea. Remember the way we can do things like theme.of context or navigator.of context? Well, to use my inherited widget, I would also like to use that .of context. So as a result, I need to actually write the function of. So what I'm going to do is inside my navbar state over here, I'm going to make a static method. And something static means that it's only one instance for, or one method, one variable for any instance of this specific class. And I'm going to call this navbar state of, and this can take a build context, because of course you guys will remember every single time we used like theme.of or whatever, we always had to pass in that context, and then open and close these curly brackets. and this is going to look really funky, but this is probably the only time you're going to have to do this. We're going to return, and then we're going to say context dot depend on inherited widget of exact type. Luckily it comes up here, so I don't need to type it all out. But again, depend on inherited widget of exact type. And then in these greater than and less than signs, I need to put the type, which in this case is going to be my whatever I'm returning here. So that's the navbar inherited widget. And then we'll put dot data. And I'm getting an error. And this error is because I gave it the wrong type here. Because if we go back to our navbar inherited widget, so the data we're holding is of type navbar state state. And because the names are a bit too funky, I forgot to write that state the second time. So when I do this, this is going to get rid of that error, and that's going to work. So now we should really quickly talk about context, because we've seen it a few times, but this is the first time we're actually having to write, context dot depend on whatever. What is the context actually doing? It's telling Flutter to look up the widget tree and find whatever is similar to this, whatever is appropriate to use in this case. So for example, when I say theme.of context, what I'm telling Flutter to do is look up the widget tree until you find a widget or until you find a property called theme. So if I was going to use it inside my, for example, in my bottom navbar, then it would go to its parent, which is, for example, the stopwatch screen. And then from the stopwatch screen, it could go into main.dart, and inside main.dart, it will find that theme data and it'll be happy and then pass that data back along. So I'm doing the same thing in my navbar states here, but this time what I'm looking for is the navbar state or the inherited widget. So based on what I just said, you can probably imagine I'm gonna have to use this widget to wrap some kind of other widget because I need my widgets to be able to look up the parent tree. So where am I going to put it? Well, I'm going to end up using my navbar state in my bottom navbar. But my bottom navbar, and this is the old version. I should be opening this one. And my bottom navbar can be the child of the different screens, timer screen, option screen, and stopwatch screen. So as a result, we need to go up one more, which is going to be our main.dart. And in main.dart, I could wrap stopwatch screen, but then I'll run into issues with the routing here. So what I'm going to have to do instead is wrap material app here. So I'm going to control click, wrap with widget, and here I can use the widget I just created. Specifically, I'm going to use navbar state. And this, of course, needs to be imported and fix my imports. And you can see my navbar state has a child of material app. This is why I needed that child property over there. And then that child property is also going to be sent to the inherited widget and so on and so forth. That's what allows me to build this nice tree-like structure and get my data directly. But we're not quite finished yet, because we're also going to need a way for bottom navbar to actually access the data. And I no longer need to have these properties because I'm going to get it a different way. So we'll delete this, and then my constructor can be much simpler as well. We get rid of this, and that should be fine. It's giving me an error because I forgot to do something. Oh yeah, I'll fix that afterwards. And the reason I'm leaving it as a stateful widget is because I need to access a property called didChangeDependencies. And what didChangeDependencies does is it runs some kind of function every single time that something our widget depends on is changed. And in this case, the thing that we're depending on is the inherited widget. And in fact, if we look here, it mentions inherited widgets specifically. For example, if the previous call to build referenced an inherited widget that later changed, the framework would call this method to notify this object about the change. So because the object is being notified about that change, it's able to rebuild. In other words, it has a lot to do with the set state. Now, some of you might have used the init init state earlier, and you might be wondering, why do I need to use did change dependencies rather than init state? Well, there's two reasons for that. First of all, if I were to use init state, it would only run that once at the beginning of my widget's lifecycle. And then what am I going to do when my widget changes? I could use set state, but is that really going to refresh everything the correct way? And then on top of that, I also need access to that context. And in that init state, I don't believe I have access to that context yet. Leaving that aside, let's see how we can actually access that. So I need the type, which is the same as before. Navbar state data equals, and I'm going to use something which is going to start to look familiar to you guys. Navbar state.of, that's why we created it, and we'll use the context here. And of course this needs to be imported like this. And then here we can do, well, we'll have to declare our int index. And here I can say index equals data.index, because of course my data object holds everything that my navbar state holds, but in this specific case, it's just the index I'm accessing. If I did have other variables here, I could access them in the same way, and I'm in the wrong place. I could access them in the same way over here. So I could say, for example, name equals data.name if I had a name or something like that. So now that I have this, wherever I was using widget.index before, I can just use index directly. And this index, of course, coming from here, which is coming from the inherited widget from navbar state. And then the only other thing I have to change is this widget callback, because it doesn't exist anymore. So what I'm going to do instead is use navbar state dot set of context dot set index. So this set index here is going here. So it's accessing my navbar state dot set index right here. And this is going to give it the IND because my OnTap is taking IND, and semicolon, and save that. Then for this, actually all of this needs to be deleted because we no longer need to give our routes all this information. This is now being handled separately. So now we can go inside our option screen, and we can just make it a stateless widget like this. And my bottom navbar no longer takes any properties, so we can delete all of that. And then in my stopwatch screen, we're going to do the same thing. I just realized I also deleted the route name, which I did not want to do. So I'm going to copy this because I absolutely still need my route name, but then do the rest. Then in my stopwatch screen, I need to close some of these so I stop getting confused. I'm going to do the same thing. So first I'm going to copy that route name. Then I'm going to delete all of this. So in fact, I could just delete this. You can tell I've been working a lot recently. My mind's not working right. So we're deleting up to the class stopwatch screen states. There. And then this becomes a stateless widget like this. And I no longer need this information here, and I can save this. And the same thing can happen in timer. Delete this. And all of this. And finally, stateless widget here. Now, of course, I'm still going to get errors in these copies, which I had of my previous code. And speaking of copying the previous code, I'm actually not going to upload these specific ones because they're going to change when I add my other state management solutions, and there's just not that much in here. So other than that, we also need to go back into main.dart because now we've gotten rid of all of this from our constructors. So we don't need any of this or this, or this. Then Control-Shift-I to format everything for us nicely. And also my app state no longer needs to be stateful. I no longer need screen index or set index. So all of this can be deleted. And this also becomes a stateless widget. And there we go. I'm just checking if I have any errors. I have errors in the copied files, but not in the current ones. So that is all perfectly fine. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen, that is how you use the inherited widget. So really quick review, what we had to do is we created a new folder called state, and in this state we created two different properties, two different classes. The first was navbar state, which actually holds the information we need, and it needs that child property, and the child properties or whatever is going to be wrapped by our widget. And then we can put all the information we want to store, as well as all the methods that we want to interact with our information in the state of whatever class we create here. And then finally, we need some kind of inherited widget, and that inherited widget is probably going to look quite similar every time, but it can hold the data of the type of state we just created. So in so doing, we're going to be able to pass along that data. And then to actually access this data, what we have to do is wrap our root widget or whatever closest ancestor we have to all the widgets we want to use as state with that widget we just created. And then whenever we actually use the properties, for example, in bottom navbar, if we override the of method, we can then use navbar state or whatever name we use .of context to access the data. So in fact, I could have just done something like this instead, but I'm not going to do it now because I've already done it like this. So I don't really want to change it. But okay, there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. If it still seems a bit, a lot of boilerplate, some weird names, don't worry about it, because next time we're going to look at provider, which is going to simplify this a lot. And then afterwards, we're going to look at getx, which is going to simplify it even more. And then afterwards, we're going to look at redux and block, which is going to complicate things all over again. But redux and block have different advantages. So yeah, I actually prefer block. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Okay, so that's been all for me today. For myself, Ovidius, I'm out.